Okay, folks, back again. This time we're looking at Section 2, and guess who's going to make an appearance? Those crazy Aryans from the prior chapters. So, again, we're looking at the exact same essential question. This is the essential question that we're going to be looking at in class. What makes these different cultures unique? What makes them different? What do we consider civilized? What isn't considered civilized? Let's get right to it. So the Aryans, we know the Aryans because they were the Indo Europeans who came from areas like Iran. They were the domesticators of the horse. That was one of their great contributions to world civilization. And they took those horses and decided to trot along the plateau of Iran into India, where the Harappans were in the collapse of their society. So, what do we know about them? Well, the Aryans depended heavily on a pastoral economy. Makes sense because they are users of horses. Horses do well on pastures. We also know that they had no writing system. They had the Vedas, which is the word of Brahma, who becomes the Hindu god of creation. And these are passed down orally initially because there is no writing system. Eventually there is a writing system developed called Sanskrit. But initially the Vedas, which again are supposed to be the word of God, okay, the Hindu god of creation, are passed down through oral tradition. Another interesting aspect about the Aryans that's worth noting is that there are two forms of language. We have the sacred language and the daily use language. This is not all that different in some ways from in Egypt, where we see a formal writing system and an informal writing system. So again, a sacred language, daily use language. We're going to see something not dissimilar when we get to medieval Europe, where we see that there is a sacred language being Latin versus daily use language, which are the local dialects, German, French, English, and Italian. This actually, in some ways, is also not that dissimilar from modern-day society. We often have the language of the educated, which has a lot of Latin roots in it, a lot of Latin words. If you go into law or medicine, there's still a lot of Latin embedded in those professions, versus daily use language, which certainly doesn't contain nearly as much Latin when you're hanging around with your homies. So, moving right along, whoever thought you'd hear the word homies when it came to a lecture on ancient India? I didn't. That was a bit of a surprise to me as well. So, moving right along, let's get into the Vedic age. So, what we have is, with the Aryans coming in, remember, the Aryans bring the Vedas, this brings the Vedic age. If you look at the time period, the Vedic age begins around the time that the Harappans are collapsing. So we have two groups of people, the Harappans and the Aryans. The Harappans have collapsed, the Aryans come in, and they're able to take charge. And not surprisingly, this interesting dynamic comes into being. The indigenous people, the Harappans, there's an Aryan word for it, Desas. And those Desas have a couple of different meanings. It either means enemy or subject people. But in either case, it recognizes a difference between one group and the other group. What we see happening politically with the Aryans is they're forming into different tribal groups, and those different tribal groups are led by a Raja. You might have heard that from such movies as Disney's Aladdin. There's going to be a lot of intertribal conflict between these different tribes, which is in some ways personified by Indra, the Aryan god of war. There is a certain religious proclivity towards violence and warfare, not a deification, but certainly a worshipping and appreciation of warfare among the Aryan people. Moving along. What else do we know? Well, we know that within 1,000 years, the Aryans have settled. They have developed agriculture, and they've developed iron metallurgy. This, again, should sound kind of familiar. settling down, agriculture, iron. Oh, that sounds like, pretty much every civilization except for the Egyptians that got beaten back by the Assyrians who adopted iron metallurgy, and then the Egyptians adopted it because of the Assyrians. Whoa, it's like iron metallurgy is kind of a thing. So here we are. The Aryans do the exact same thing. What we see happening is where initially the Aryans are we see these local conflicts between the Rajas. Eventually, those tribal groups consolidate and consolidate and consolidate until you have these regional kingdoms developing into these sort of city-states, not unlike what we see in medieval Europe. Not that dissimilar at all, as a matter of fact. Okay, this brings us to the origin of the caste system. One of the things that was mentioned in class was that an element of these early civilizations is social hierarchy. Well, the caste system is social hierarchy on steroids. Here's the great thing about it, is where in many of these societies, social hierarchy was fluid. One of the exceptions, of course, being political leaders if there was something like a monarch, in which case the next ruler was chosen hereditarily. But especially among other lower classes, you could go up, you could go down within the social hierarchy within a single generation. India is different, though. In India, the caste system is rigid. You are born into it and you will die there. What's interesting is where caste comes from. The Sanskrit word for caste is varna, which means color. So when you think about it, color and social class are related. Color of what, you might ask? Well, think about the American experience. Have we seen color and social class being related? If the answer is yes, then congratulations, you passed U.S. History 101. Yeah, for most of our history, being black meant that you were a lower social class than if you were white. The same thing seems to be true in ancient India. What's kind of messed up about that Indian system, just like it was messed up in the American system, is this carried on for a tremendous period of time. In the case of India, we're talking thousands of years. The caste system wasn't actually abolished until halfway through the 20th century. They're still dealing with elements of the caste system, and we're talking about its emergence around 1500 BCE, 3,500 years ago. This picture to the right that you're going to see is actually the current composition of the different castes in India today. You'll notice, and this gives you a pretty good idea of what percentage of people fell into those particular branches of the social hierarchy. The Shudras, the serving class, were the vast majority of people. The people towards the bottom of the social class made up the majority. The people on the top, teeny tiny percentage of people. 3.5% of the population was actually in the Brahmin class. And then we have the dots, the scheduled castes, and we're going to talk about that momentarily. So that moment has come. Let's move on to the next slide. So here are social distinctions among the Indians by the late Vedic age. By 1000 BCE, we have distinct castes. And you'll notice that your caste has a correlation with the occupation you do. At the top are the Brahmins. They are the priest class. They are the scholars. They are the learned people. They are the government leaders. They are the ones at the top of the social hierarchy. You'll notice that the second class of people are the warriors, the fighters. The fighters and warriors are not at the top of the social hierarchy. They're behind, again, the priestly class. That says something very interesting about this civilization. We have merchants and landowners who are in that third tier. Again, like in China, merchants are valued for their contribution to society. This is different than in other societies where merchants are actually seen as sort of parasitic on society. So that is something unique to India and China. Then you have the Shudras, which are at the bottom again. That's the 52% of the population. The vast majority of the population are in that servant class. They are literally subordinate to the other classes. They are the ones who serve the people in the three upper classes. And then you have the untouchables. Here's an interesting thing about the untouchables. If you are an untouchable, if you are born into the untouchable class, you are going to be doing the most lowly, demeaning, dirty, and dangerous work that society has to offer. You are the person who is emptying septic tanks, only you don't have the nice big septic pump to pump it all out. No, 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 no. You're going down there with buckets. You're not doing the kind of job that you probably want to do. But what's interesting is the untouchables are called untouchable for a reason. They are considered tainted, dirty people who you do not want to come into contact with, to the point where if someone from the untouchable class passes by you and their mere shadow crosses over your food, you can't eat the food. You have to throw it away because it has been tainted by the shadow of an untouchable. You do not want them, any part of them, even the shadow of them, to fall upon you. So, very interesting, and again, this is a rigid social hierarchy. Moving on to the next slide. Now, there are all these subcastes because you have these main castes, but you have all these subgroups within there. It's not really worth our time going into all those subcastes, but it's important to understand that there are all these subdivisions within the class. Merchants and artisans, and what kind of merchant you are and how long you've been a merchant for affects what subcaste you're in. What's important to understand is that there is this very rigid, elaborate scheme of social classification, very central to the ancient Indians, for reasons that we're really going to get into in the next lecture, primarily having to do with religion. So, and there are all these rules for how you should behave, not dissimilar from what we see in China. These are the rules of etiquette that you are supposed to conform to as a member of this caste. So, last thing, actually, second to last thing, is that it's important to understand that while the caste is rigid, there is some degree of social mobility. It is tremendously difficult. Do not overstate this idea that there was some caste social mobility. Yes, you could. We're talking about a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of people who are actually able to go up or down in the caste system. Got to tell you, more likely than not, you were going down instead of coming up, because it's easier to be a screw-up than a success. Let's be honest. Last slide. Oh, patriarchy. Oh, patriarchy. You show your evil head again. Patriarchy, one of the classic signs of ancient civilization, something that seems to come up again and again and again and again and again. So, what is the role of the man in ancient Indian society? Well, think of 1950s United States. The idea was that men were supposed to honor, love, and respect their wives. At the same time, they were expected to provide financially for their families. Women were to be obedient to their men. Think of the vows when you get married, to love and obey. And the idea of the woman was emphasis on the obey. You do what your husband says, he takes care of you, so you better obey him. And the other two things that women were expected to do is they were supposed to make babies and they were supposed to take care of the house. Now, there's one thing that is unique about classic India that carries forth at least into the 19th century and possibly into the 20th century, maybe even the 21st. We occasionally hear stories of that. And that's the very last bullet point, the practice called sati. Remember that women were considered to be a burden onto families. Women were burdens. And so the idea was when your husband died, you did not want to burden your family. And so what was the honorable and respectable thing to do? The honorable and respectable thing to do in classical India was to kill yourself. The way that funerals were conducted in classical India, as they are conducted now, was through cremation. And so the woman's expectation was upon their husband's death, as their husbands are being cremated, that they would throw themselves onto the funeral pyre. I am not making this up. This is exactly what happened. Look it up online. It was a practice, and it is still possibly going on to this very day in 2014. This is going to bring us to the end of section 2. We've covered a lot of material, and I'm hoping to unpack a lot of that material in class. Thank you for watching, and we'll pick it up next time with Section 3.